They took his eyes, but they couldn't take his purpose. Samson stands chained in a Philistine prison, blind and broken, grinding grain like an animal. His enemies walk past and laugh. They mock the God he once served. They celebrate his downfall as proof their gods are stronger. But what they don't see is that his hair is growing back. And something else is growing too. Something deeper than muscle. Something he lost long before they ever gouged out his eyes. This is the man who once tore lions apart with his bare hands, who carried city gates on his shoulders, who made kings tremble and armies flee, the strongest man who ever lived. And just when it seemed his story was over, God was only beginning. Samson's greatest battle was never against the Philistines. It was against himself, against pride, against desire, against the quiet compromises that cost him everything. He thought strength meant power. He was wrong. This is the story of how he fell, how he lost everything that made him legendary, and how God met him in the ruins, how shame became glory, how surrender became the truest strength of all. Samson was set apart for God from birth, a Nazarite with a divine calling. But his journey began long before he was born, in the darkness of a nation that had forgotten its God. For 40 years, Israel lived under the shadow of the Philistines. 40 years of humiliation, 40 years of oppression, 40 years of watching their enemies grow stronger while they grew weaker. The Philistines didn't just conquer with swords, they conquered with iron. While Israel still fought with bronze weapons, the Philistines had mastered the secret of forging iron. Their blades were sharper, their armor was thicker, their control was absolute. They didn't just dominate the land, they dominated the spirit of the people. Israel had fallen into the same cycle again. They turned away from God, they worshipped idols, they forgot the covenant. And when the consequences came, they cried out for help. But this time, God's answer came differently, quietly, intimately, in a small village in the tribe of Dan. There lived a man named Manoah and his wife. She was barren, unable to have children. In that culture, barrenness wasn't just a personal sorrow. It was seen as a sign of divine disfavor, a mark of shame. But God has always had a way of using what the world calls impossible. One day, an angel of the Lord appeared to Manoah's wife, face to face, undeniably real. He told her, "You will conceive and give birth to a son. No razor may be used on his head, because the boy is to be a Nazarite, dedicated to God from the womb. He will take the lead in delivering Israel from the hands of the Philistines." As written in Judges chapter 13, when Manoah offered a sacrifice, the angel ascended in the flame. The couple fell to the ground, trembling, not in fear, but in awe. They had just witnessed the impossible, and soon, from a barren womb, God would begin his rescue. The child's name would be Samson, little son, a flicker of light in a nation drowning in darkness. Samson was born under a vow that would define his entire life. The Nazarite vow, a sacred commitment that set certain individuals apart for God's purposes. 3 simple rules: no wine or strong drink, no contact with anything dead or unclean, and no razor could ever touch his head. These weren't arbitrary restrictions. They were symbols of consecration, of separation, of complete dependence on God. Samson's strength didn't come from his muscles, it came from his calling, from the Spirit of the Lord that rested on him because of his dedication to God. His parents raised him with this truth. They reminded him that he wasn't like other boys, that his life had a purpose woven into it before he even took his first breath. And as he grew, so did the evidence of God's favor. The Spirit of the Lord began to stir in him. There were moments, brief, powerful moments, when something beyond human ability would surge through his veins. a glimpse of what he was meant to become. He was called to be a deliverer, a judge, someone who would push back the darkness that had covered Israel for 40 years. But here's what no one could have predicted. God gave him strength to shake nations, but he didn't give him immunity from temptation. Samson had the power to tear apart lions, but he couldn't always control his own desires. He could break chains with his hands, but he struggled to break the chains around his heart. From the very beginning, there was a tension in his life, a battle between the divine calling on his shoulders and the human weaknesses that lived in his chest. And it was in that tension, between who he was meant to be and who he often chose to be, that his story would unfold. A story of extraordinary power and devastating compromise. The first crack in Samson's armor didn't come from an enemy's sword. It came from his own heart. One day, Samson traveled to Timnah, a Philistine town, and there he saw a woman, a Philistine woman, and he wanted her. He went back to his parents and said, "Get her for me as my wife." His parents were devastated. "Isn't there a woman among our own people?" they pleaded. "Do you have to marry a Philistine?" But Samson insisted, "Get her for me. She's the one I want." It wasn't love, it was desire. And desire, when left unchecked, has a way of rewriting our priorities. On the road to Timnah, something happened that should have been a warning. A young lion came roaring toward him, and in that moment, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon Samson. He tore the lion apart with his bare hands as easily as someone might tear a piece of cloth. It was a demonstration of divine strength, a reminder of who he was and what he carried. But later, when Samson passed by that same spot, he saw something strange. Inside the carcass of the lion, bees had made a hive, and there was honey. He reached in, took the honey, ate it, even gave some to his parents. It seems small, doesn't it? Just honey, just a little sweetness from something dead. But it wasn't small. It was a violation of his vow, contact with a dead body, forbidden for a Nazirite. And he didn't just break the vow, he hid it. He didn't tell his parents where the honey came from. This is how great downfalls begin. Quietly, in the shadows of small compromises, we convince ourselves don't matter. Samson tasted the sweetness, and he convinced himself the cost was worth it. But compromises have a way of growing, of demanding more, of leading us further than we ever intended to go. And Samson's journey into compromise had only just begun. Samson's wedding feast lasted 7 days, as was the custom. And during that celebration, his pride began to show itself in ways that would cost him dearly. 30 Philistine men were assigned to be his companions during the feast. And Samson, confident in his secret strength, decided to make a wager. He crafted a riddle based on his encounter with the lion. Out of the eater, something to eat. Out of the strong, something sweet. The bet was high. If they could solve it within 7 days, Samson would give them 30 linen garments and 30 sets of clothes. If they couldn't, they would owe him the same. It was a game, a display of intellectual superiority to match his physical dominance. But the Philistines couldn't solve it. And as the days passed, their frustration turned to anger. On the 7th day, they went to Samson's bride with a threat. "Coax your husband into explaining the riddle, or we'll burn you and your father's household to death." Terror gripped her. She went to Samson weeping. "You hate me. You don't really love me. You've given my people a riddle, but you haven't told me the answer." For days she pressed him, manipulated him, accused him of not loving her. And finally, worn down by her tears, Samson told her the answer. She immediately told the Philistines. On the 7th day, just before sunset, the men came to Samson with the answer. "What is sweeter than honey?" What is stronger than a lion? Samson knew instantly what had happened. Betrayal burned in his chest. "If you had not plowed with my heifer," he said bitterly, "you would not have solved my riddle." The Spirit of the Lord came upon him in fury. He went to Ashkelon, struck down 30 of their men, took their belongings, and gave the garments to those who had solved the riddle. Then he stormed away, leaving his bride behind. Pride blinds us long before the enemy ever can. And Samson's pride had just opened a door to devastation that he couldn't yet see. Sometime later, Samson's anger cooled. He decided to return to his wife, bringing a young goat as a gift. But when he arrived at her father's house, the father stopped him at the door. "I was so sure you hated her," the man said, "that I gave her to your companion. But her younger sister is more attractive. Take her instead." The words hit Samson like a blow. Not just rejection, replacement. His wife, given to another man, his friend, one of the 30 who had betrayed him with the riddle. And something inside Samson snapped. "This time I have a right to get even with the Philistines," he said. "I will really harm them." He went out and caught 300 foxes. He tied them in pairs by their tails and fastened torches between each pair. Then he lit the torches and released them into the Philistine fields. The foxes ran in panic, spreading fire everywhere they went. The wheat fields burned. The vineyards turned to ash. The olive groves, symbols of prosperity and peace, were consumed by flames. The Philistines lost everything: their harvest, their livelihood, their future. When they discovered it was Samson who had done this, because his wife had been given to another, they didn't retaliate against him. They retaliated against her. They went to her father's house and burned them both alive. When Samson heard what they had done, grief collided with rage. The woman he had wanted, the woman who had betrayed him, was now dead because of him. He attacked the Philistines with such ferocity that the Bible simply says he slaughtered many of them. Then he fled to a cave in the rock of Etam, hiding from the consequences of his own fury. When anger becomes your master, your victories turn to ashes. Samson had wanted revenge. He got it, but the cost was a trail of death that included the very person he once desired. And the worst part, he was more isolated than ever, alone in a cave, hunted, hated by his enemies and misunderstood by his own people. The deliverer had become the destroyer. The Philistines weren't going to let Samson hide. They marched into Judah with their armies, demanding that Israel hand over the man who had caused so much destruction. And here's where the story takes a heartbreaking turn. 3,000 men of Judah, Samson's own people, went to the cave where he was hiding. Not to protect him, not to stand with him, but to bind him and hand him over to the enemy. "Don't you realize the Philistines are ruling over us?" they said. "What have you done to us?" Samson looked at them, the very people he was called to deliver. And they were treating him like the problem. "I merely did to them what they did to me," he replied. But they didn't care about justice. They cared about survival, about keeping the peace, about not rocking the boat. "We've come to tie you up and hand you over to the Philistines," they said. Samson made them promise only one thing: "Swear to me that you won't kill me yourselves." They agreed. They bound him with 2 new ropes and led him out of the cave like a criminal. When the Philistines saw him approaching, they shouted in triumph. Their enemy, captured, bound, powerless. But then something happened. The Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon Samson. The ropes on his arms became like charred flax. They snapped and fell away as if they were nothing. Samson looked around and saw the jawbone of a donkey lying on the ground. He grabbed it, and what followed was a massacre. 1,000 Philistines fell that day. 1,000 men struck down by a weapon that should have been worthless. When it was over, Samson named the place Ramath-lehi, Jawbone Hill. He had been bound by men, but freed by God's purpose, rejected by his own people, but empowered by the Spirit. God can turn what's discarded into a weapon of victory. Even when everyone else has given up on you, he hasn't. But victory came with a cost, and Samson was about to learn what true dependence really meant. After the battle, Samson stood among the bodies of 1,000 men. His chest heaved. His hands still gripped the jawbone. The adrenaline began to fade, and then he felt it. Thirst. Not just ordinary thirst, the kind that makes your throat close, that makes your vision blur, that reminds you how fragile you really are. He had just experienced supernatural strength, divine power flowing through him like a flood. And now, in the silence after the storm, he was dying of thirst. Samson cried out to God, "You have given your servant this great victory. Must I now die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised?" It was a prayer of desperation, of humility, of total dependence. And God answered. As written in Judges chapter 15, God opened up the hollow place in Lehi, and water came out of it, straight from the rock itself. Samson drank, his strength returned, his spirit revived, and he named that place En-Hakkore, Spring of the Caller, a memorial to the moment when God met his need in the wilderness. This is what Samson needed to remember, what we all need to remember. Strength without dependence is just pride waiting to collapse. Power without prayer is a foundation built on sand. Only the thirsty learn what grace really tastes like. For a moment, Samson understood. God wasn't just the source of his strength. He was the source of his survival, his breath, his very life. But moments of clarity don't always last, and the next chapter of Samson's story would reveal just how quickly he could forget what he learned in the wilderness. Years passed. Samson continued to judge Israel. His reputation grew, his legend spread. But his spiritual vision, that was fading. One day Samson went to Gaza, a major Philistine city deep in enemy territory. And there he went to see a prostitute. It was reckless, arrogant, a man set apart for God, seeking pleasure in the arms of the enemy. Word spread quickly. Samson is here. The Philistines saw their opportunity. They surrounded the place and lay in wait at the city gate all night. At dawn, they whispered, "We'll kill him." They thought they had him trapped, cornered, finished. But at midnight, Samson got up. He walked to the city gates, the massive doors that protected Gaza. Gates that would take multiple men to move. Gates that symbolized the city's strength and security. And he tore them off their hinges. Not just the doors, the doorposts, the bar, everything. He lifted them onto his shoulders and carried them to the top of the hill that faces Hebron, miles away. It was a statement, a display of dominance, a mockery of Philistine power. The man was unstoppable, untouchable, invincible, or so it seemed. But here's the tragedy. Samson could lift the gates of Gaza, but he couldn't lift the weight of his own desires. He could tear down the strongholds of cities, but he couldn't tear down the strongholds in his own heart. His strength was still supernatural, but his choices were becoming increasingly carnal. He was winning battles, but losing the war within himself, and he didn't even realize it. Pride has a way of blinding us to our own vulnerabilities, of convincing us that because we're strong in one area, we're invincible in all areas. Samson was about to learn the hardest lesson of his life, because the enemy he couldn't defeat wasn't waiting behind city gates. She was waiting in the valley of Sorek, and her name was Delilah, and she would do what armies could not. Samson fell in love with her. Or at least, he thought it was love. Maybe it was obsession. Maybe it was loneliness. Maybe it was the same pattern that had marked his entire life, desire overruling discernment. The Philistine rulers saw their opportunity. They came to Delilah with an offer: 1,100 shekels of silver from each of them if she could discover the secret of Samson's strength. It was a fortune, enough to secure her future forever, and so she began her work. "Tell me the secret of your great strength," she whispered. "How could someone tie you up and subdue you?" Samson played with her. He lied. "Tie me with 7 fresh bowstrings that have not been dried," he said. She did. The Philistines hid in the room. She cried out, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you." He snapped the bowstrings like thread. They still didn't know. She tried again. "You made a fool of me. Now tell me how you can be tied." "Tie me with new ropes that have never been used," he said. She did. Again the Philistines waited. Again she cried out. And again Samson broke free effortlessly, a third time. "You've made a fool of me again. Tell me how you can be tied." "Weave the 7 braids of my head into the fabric on the loom," he said. She did. She fastened it with the pin. "Samson, the Philistines are upon you." He woke up and pulled away the pin and the loom. But Delilah wasn't finished. She had a weapon more powerful than ropes or bowstrings: manipulation. "How can you say, 'I love you,' when you won't confide in me?" she said. "This is the 3rd time you've made a fool of me and haven't told me the secret of your great strength." Day after day she pressed him, nagged him, wore him down until, as the Bible says, he was sick to death of it. And finally, Samson told her everything. "No razor has ever been used on my head," he said, "because I have been a Nazirite dedicated to God from my mother's womb. If my head were shaved, my strength would leave me, and I would become as weak as any other man." Delilah knew. This was the truth. She lulled him to sleep on her lap, and while he slept, she called for someone to shave off the 7 braids of his hair. Then she called out, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you." He woke up, thinking he would escape as before, but this time something was different. The Bible says it in the most devastating sentence in his entire story. He did not know that the Lord had left him. The Philistines seized him, gouged out his eyes, bound him with bronze shackles, and took him down to Gaza, where he once carried the gates, and made him grind grain in the prison. He lost his eyes, but it wasn't blindness that defeated him. It was forgetting where his strength came from. Samson, the strongest man alive, was now blind, chained and grinding grain like an animal in a Philistine prison. The wheel turned, round and round, day after day, the same monotonous rhythm, the same humiliation. The Philistines would pass by and mock him, laugh at him, spit on him. The man who once made them tremble was now their entertainment. But something was happening in that prison that no one could see. Each rotation of the mill became a prayer. Each step in the darkness became a moment of reflection. Each chain that bound his body couldn't bind the awakening happening in his soul. For the first time in years, maybe for the first time in his life, Samson had nothing left to rely on but God. No strength to boast in, no eyes to lust with, no freedom to chase his desires. Just silence, darkness, and the slow, painful work of repentance. His hair began to grow back. The Philistines didn't notice, or maybe they didn't care. After all, they had already broken him. They had gouged out his eyes. What could hair do now? But they didn't understand what Samson was finally beginning to understand. His strength had never been about his hair. It was about his consecration, his dedication, his covenant with God. And in the grinding stone prison of Gaza, Samson was being consecrated again, not by a vow his parents made, but by a surrender he was choosing for himself. The man who once saw everything with his eyes was now seeing for the first time with his heart. Meanwhile, the Philistines were preparing a celebration, a great festival to honor their god Dagon. "Our God has delivered Samson, our enemy, into our hands," they declared. They gathered by the thousands, rulers, warriors, men and women, filling the temple of Dagon. 3,000 people crowded onto the roof alone, watching and celebrating below. And in the midst of their triumph, someone had an idea. "Bring out Samson! Let him entertain us." So they brought him out of the prison, the blind judge, the broken deliverer, the man who once carried city gates now stumbling between the pillars of their temple. They laughed, they mocked, they celebrated their God's victory over the God of Israel. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't see, was that God wasn't finished with Samson. He wasn't finished forging strength that comes only through surrender. He wasn't finished writing redemption into the story of a man who had lost everything. The Philistines thought they were watching Samson's end. They had no idea they were about to witness the beginning of his legacy, because the weakest moment of Samson's life was about to become the most powerful. The temple of Dagon was packed, wall to wall, shoulder to shoulder, 3,000 people on the roof alone, all gathered to celebrate what they believed was the ultimate victory of their God over the God of Israel. And there, in the center of it all, stood Samson, blind, chained, a spectacle for their amusement. They made him perform, made him dance, made him stumble. The laughter echoed off the stone walls. But Samson wasn't thinking about the crowd, he was thinking about the pillars. He turned to the servant who was guiding him and said quietly, "Put me where I can feel the pillars that support the temple, so that I may lean against them." The servant, seeing no harm in it, positioned him between the two central pillars, the load-bearing columns that held the entire structure. Samson reached out. His hands found the cold stone. He felt the weight of the temple resting on these pillars, thousands of lives suspended above him. And then he prayed, not a prayer of vengeance, not a cry of bitterness, but a prayer of surrender. "Sovereign Lord, remember me. Please, God, strengthen me just once more, and let me with one blow get revenge on the Philistines for my 2 eyes." It was the prayer of a broken man who had finally learned that strength doesn't come from what we can do, but from what God can do through us when we surrender everything. The Spirit of the Lord, silent for so long, returned. Samson braced himself. He pushed with everything he had, not the strength of his arms, but the strength of God flowing through him one final time. "Let me die with the Philistines," he whispered. And he pushed. The pillars cracked, the stone groaned, and then, in a deafening roar, the entire temple collapsed. The roof caved in, the walls crumbled, 3,000 people fell in an instant. The rulers of the Philistines, the very men who had orchestrated his downfall, were crushed under the weight of their own celebration. And Samson, the blind judge who had lost everything, died in the rubble. But here's what the Bible tells us. Thus he killed many more when he died than while he lived. In his death, Samson accomplished what he failed to accomplish in all his years of strength, not through pride, not through power, not through conquest, but through surrender. The man who lost everything found his true strength only when he let go, when he stopped relying on himself and finally, completely, depended on God. His final act wasn't about revenge, it was about redemption. It was about a God who can take our greatest failures and turn them into his greatest victories. Samson's body was recovered by his brothers. They brought him back and buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol in the tomb of his father Manoah. He had judged Israel for 20 years. But his legacy would last far longer than that, because in the end, it wasn't really about him. It was about the God who never gave up on him. Samson's story is paradoxical. It's a warning and a promise wrapped together. A warning about the cost of compromise, about how small choices lead to devastating consequences, about how even God-given gifts can be squandered when we place our desires above our calling. But it's also a promise that God's calling isn't cancelled by our failure, that his purpose isn't derailed by our weakness, that even in our deepest shame, redemption is still possible. Samson's blindness wasn't his end. It was the beginning of true vision. In the darkness, he finally saw what he had missed his entire life. That strength without surrender is just weakness disguised. That power without dependence is a foundation built on sand. He spent years fighting enemies, but his greatest battle was always internal, against pride, against lust, against the belief that he could carry God's calling without actually walking with God. And when he lost everything, his eyes, his freedom, his reputation, he finally found what he had been looking for all along: purpose, peace, the presence of God. Centuries later, the writer of Hebrews would list Samson among the heroes of faith, because in the end, despite every failure, he surrendered. There's a shadow of something greater in Samson's final act, a man stretching out his arms in death to defeat the enemy, giving his life to save his people. It echoes forward to another man, another sacrifice, another moment when weakness became the pathway to victory. Jesus, stretched out on a cross, arms wide, defeating sin and death through surrender. Samson's life points us to a deeper truth. God's strength is perfected in our weakness. His glory shines brightest when we stop pretending we have it all together and finally admit we need him. What if the moments you regret most are the very ones God can use to reveal his greatest strength in you? What if your darkest chapter isn't the end of your story, but the place where redemption begins? Samson teaches us that it's never too late, that God can meet us in the prison, in the chains, in the grinding stone monotony of our failures, and he can still do something beautiful. Samson's journey took him from strength to failure, from sight to blindness, from pride to surrender. But it didn't end in defeat. It ended in redemption. Maybe you're in your own Gaza right now, chained by regret, blinded by shame, grinding through the same painful rhythms, wondering if God can still use you after everything you've done. Samson's story is your reminder that he can, that your past doesn't disqualify you, that your weaknesses don't surprise him, that the moments you thought disqualified you from his purpose might actually be the very place where his strength begins. God didn't write Samson off when he failed. He met him in the prison, restored him in the darkness, and gave him one more chance to fulfill his calling. Through surrender, the very thing his pride had refused. And he'll do the same for you. If this message spoke to you, if it reminded you that redemption is still possible, share it with someone who needs to hear it, someone who's still trying to stand again, someone who thinks it's too late for them, because you never know, your act of faith might be exactly what lifts another person's soul. Samson's legacy isn't that he was perfect, it's that he was redeemed. And that same redemption is available to anyone willing to surrender. So if you're grinding stones in the dark right now, remember, your hair is growing back, your strength is being restored, and God isn't finished with your story yet. May your weakness become the place where God's strength begins.